Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Max Clark, and on behalf of the Fox Alliance and our team here, we are grateful that you have chosen to join us today for Fiscal Reality Check, Unpacking the One Big Beautiful Bill. This is our third quarter Beyond the Noise webcast, and our presenters today are going to be myself and Laura Cooper, both wealth advisors here with Fox Alliance, and also Josh Renfro, one of the partners here at the firm. A couple of housekeeping items before we get started. Because of the regulation in our industry, we are unable to take questions via the chat feature here on the Zoom call. So if you are interested in asking a question throughout the presentation, please do so by emailing me at the email there on the screen. So I'll go ahead and get things kicked off, and then we will move on over to Laura, who will take up the next part of the presentation. As many of you guys know from our title here, we're going to be getting into the details of the Big Beautiful Bill, which was promoted by Trump all throughout his campaign, and then ultimately was signed into law by him on July 4th, 2025. This was really a big bill, which combined a lot of his campaign promises and had a lot to do with tax legislation, some spending cuts, those sorts of things. And it passed by a very narrow margin. In the Senate, it actually was a tie vote, 50-50 for and against. And J.D. Vance, the vice president, had to cast the deciding vote to get that passed. And then in the House, it only passed by a couple of votes there. So it very narrowly made it to Trump's desk, but he ultimately signed it into law on July 4th. Now we're going to get into a lot of the impacts here, and I will say that our discussions are by no means exhaustive here. There is a lot of changes and tax adjustments and those sorts of things incorporated into this bill. But what we've sought to do here is to point out the most significant changes that are most likely to impact our clients. So we'll start out by taking a look at the tax changes, and we're going to break that down into two main categories. One would be the permanent changes or the permanent adjustments there, those that will take an act of Congress to change in the future. And then also there's a few adjustments or changes that have been introduced here that will sunset or that are temporary and will go away at some point in the future. The next two categories that we'll take a look at are spending cuts and spending increases, and we'll get into those briefly. So let's kick things off by taking a look at the tax changes that have been introduced under the Big Beautiful Bill. If you guys remember, we've had conversations about this in the past, but the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, which was the major tax legislation that was passed during Trump's first term, significantly reduced income taxes for individuals. And those tax brackets that were put in place, or what we're under currently, were set to expire or set to sunset at the end of this year. So this was the last year that we were going to see the current tax brackets and tax rates. With the Big Beautiful Bill, the current tax rates and brackets have been made permanent. So that's not going to sunset going forward. Will be the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act tax brackets and rates have been made permanent and will not be changed unless Congress acts in the future. There was one minor adjustment to that, and that was that the 10% and 12% tax brackets got a slightly or saw a slight increase to their brackets. So a couple $100 in both instances. Not a major impact, but it does give a little bit more room for that 10% and 12% tax bracket. So this is probably one of the biggest pieces of the bill, was the making permanent of the current income tax brackets. In addition to that, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act back in 2017, 2018 increased the standard deduction by double. And at the end of this year, we were set to see that expire and see the standard deductions get cut in half, again, reverting back to what they were before. Well, the Big Beautiful Bill actually increases the standard deduction slightly. So for a married filing jointly couple, currently in 2025, we have a $30,000 standard deduction. And with the passage of the Big Beautiful Bill, that went up by $1,500. So in 2025, we're going to see a $31,500 standard deduction for married filing jointly. and $15,750 for single filers. And that is permanent going forward and will increase with inflation each year. So those are probably the two biggest changes in the bill at this point. A few other permanent adjustments that we'll cover. In 2022, private mortgage insurance deduction went away. What is private mortgage insurance? Private mortgage insurance is the insurance that mortgage companies or banks require their borrowers to take out if they do not put more than 20% down on the house that they're purchasing. And that insurance or that mortgage insurance is there to protect the lender, the bank or the mortgage company, not us or the borrower. And so that is put in place. It costs, can be a couple $100 per month. But in 2022, that used to be deductible, but it got eliminated. Now, going forward, that is a permanent deduction. You do have to itemize deductions to take advantage of that, and it does phase out over a certain income threshold, but that deduction is back and will be permanent going forward. In addition to that, the child tax credit, under the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, that had been doubled. It was $1,000 historically, got increased to $2,000 per child, but it was set to sunset and go back to $1,000 at the end of this year. Going forward with the big, beautiful bill, the child tax credit has been increased to $2,200 per child. And first time this has ever been the case, and it's in the child tax credit's 30-year history, it will be indexed for inflation. So we'll see that going up each year with inflation. That will obviously help those that have a lot of children in their family and just add another deduction or a credit really associated with filing taxes. Now, one of the major changes associated with this bill, and it's going to be permanent going forward, has to do with charitable donations and the deductions that you can take for that. Probably one of the big critiques associated with the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act that was passed during Trump's first term was the changes or the impact, kind of unintended impact that it had on charitable donations. So the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, as I mentioned earlier, increased the standard deduction by double. It doubled it. And as a result, you saw far fewer people taking advantage of itemizing deductions. Well, you can only get tax benefits for making charitable donations historically by itemizing deductions. And when everybody went, it was something like well over 90% of people after the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act were taking the standard deduction. And as a result, charitable donations were far less interesting from a tax standpoint. Well, the big, beautiful bill makes an attempt to address that. And there are two main changes that they make. Let's take a look at itemizing deductions. If you itemize deductions, under previous law, you could make charitable donations and you could deduct those charitable donations depending on how they were made, up to 30% or 60% of your adjusted gross income. Well, under this new law, they have introduced a 0.5% floor. Starting in 2026, the charitable donations that you make have to exceed 0.5% of your adjusted gross income before you can deduct them. So let's assume that you have a $200,000 income. 0.5% of that would be $1,000. So you have to have $1,000 or more in charitable donations before you can start making those deductions. Let's assume, for example, that you've got $10,000 in donations that you want to deduct. Well, 0.5% of your AGI is $1,000. That's the floor. You don't get to deduct the floor. So of that $10,000, only $9,000 is deductible. But the $1,000 can be carried over into future years, but in future years, it has to meet that 0.5% floor again. So essentially, that's going to reduce the deductible nature of those charitable donations when you're itemizing deductions. And I believe Congress probably did that in an effort to kind of fund the new deduction, which we call a below-the-line deduction on the standard deduction side. So if you take the standard deduction, you now, starting in 2026, have the ability as a single filer to take a $1,000 deduction in addition to the standard deduction if you make cash charitable donations of $1,000 or more. And for joint, you can do up to $2,000 in deductions. And again, this is only specific to cash donations and wouldn't account for donations of stock or anything like that. But it is their attempt to kind of introduce more incentives for making charitable donations going forward. So it'll be interesting to see how that impacts charitable giving in the future. Another permanent tax change, which will be encouraging to a lot of small business owners, under the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, there was the introduction of what's called the Section 199A deduction. And this allowed eligible business owners to deduct up to 20% of their qualified business income from pass-through businesses. So this would be things like sole proprietorships, LLCs that have the income passed through to the underlying owners. And essentially, that allows them to deduct a meaningful portion of the income that they're earning from their business. That has been made permanent and will continue going forward. It is set to go away at the end of this year, but going forward, it will be permanent. The last permanent tax change that we'll talk about here has to do with estate tax. So under the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, we saw the estate tax exemption, your lifetime exemption that you could exclude from estate tax, increased by double. So it went up meaningfully. And in 2025, we're currently sitting at about almost $14 million per person that can be excluded from estate tax. Well, starting in 2026, the Big Beautiful Bill has increased that number to $15 million per person. It will be indexed for inflation going forward. So that's about $30 million per couple, and makes that permanent. So it's not set to sunset at any point. Obviously, that could change based on what future congressional decisions are. But that puts us in a position where we've got clarity now going forward, at least currently, on what estate tax is going to look like. Now let's shift over and take a look at some of the temporary or sunsetting tax provisions in this bill. For those of you that may live in high income tax states, say California, New York, you will be pleased to know that SALT deductions have been increased pretty dramatically. That had been changed to $10,000 per year previously, but starting in 2025, starting this year, those SALT deductions have been increased. And SALT, by the way, stands for state and local taxes. You can deduct the taxes that you pay at the state and local level from your federal taxes. That deduction limit has been increased to $40,000, and it's going to increase by 1% per year for the next 4 years. But in 2030, it will sunset and revert back to $10,000. So this will be very beneficial for those that have high state and local taxes. Couple of other sunsetting provisions. You know that during Trump's campaign, one of his big promises or efforts that he was going to pursue was no tax on Social Security. And this bill does not eliminate tax on Social Security. Social Security is still taxed, but they introduced something that sought to eliminate or at least reduce the tax burden on seniors. And this new senior deduction is $6,000 for single filers and $12,000 for joint filers, assuming that both of the filers are over the age or 65 or older. And this starts in 2025. So if you take the standard deduction and you get that $31,500 as a joint couple, and you both are the age of 65 or older, you can deduct another $12,000 in addition to that 31,500. If only one of you is over the age of 65 or 65 or older, then you can take the $6,000 deduction. This does phase out once your modified adjusted gross income is over $75,000 as a single filer and $150,000 as a joint filer. But an interesting new deduction in addition to the standard deduction. And again, this is temporary, will only be for this year and the next 3 years. Another one of Trump's campaign promises was no tax on tips. Again, this bill technically does not eliminate tax on tips. Tips are still taxable. They are still subject to Social Security tax, employment tax, those types of things. But there has been a new below-the-line deduction of $25,000 introduced for qualified tip income. And so if you take the standard deduction, this would be in addition to that. From 2025 through 2028, so this year plus 3 others, you can take up to $25,000, whether you're single or joint filers, from your qualified tip income, assuming it meets the following conditions. It has to be from an occupation that traditionally and customarily receives tips. The tips have to be voluntary, and they must not be earned through a specified service, trade, or business. For example, lawyers, accountants, financial advisors. And this really put a wrench in the gears of our plan to have all of you guys pay us in tips to reduce our tax bill. I'm just kidding, obviously. It is obviously limited to those that traditionally and customarily receive tips and would not apply to industries like ours. Now, what is interesting is currently musicians, artists, and entertainers are included in that specified service, trade, or business. And they make a lot of their income from tips as well. And so currently they're excluded from this benefit. That may change in the future. We will see. There was one other campaign promise that Trump made, which was no tax on overtime. And there was kind of a similar deduction that was introduced. Overtime is still taxable, but it allows you to deduct some of that if you have overtime as well. The last sunsetting provision that we'll talk about here is auto loan interest deduction. It is an additional below the line deduction. You do not have to itemize deductions in order to take advantage of this. You can deduct up to $10,000 per year for interest on auto loans that you take out to buy a new vehicle. So the following conditions must be met. It has to be a new vehicle, has to be assembled in the United States, and only interest on new loans taken after December 31st, 2024. That does, from what I understand, refinancing a current loan on a new vehicle is something that you could do to qualify for the interest deduction. But interesting addition, it does phase out. You can see there for modified adjusted gross income of over 100,000 for those that are single or head of household, and 200,000 for joint. Again, this is only in effect for 4 years this year and 3 more. Now, a few other items that we want to talk about. We've classified under these as tax changes, but they are kind of classified as other. And the first has to do with 529 plans. So past legislation, the Secure Act, the Secure Act 2.0, Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, made some real positive expansions to 529 plans. And the Big Beautiful Bill has furthered those even more. Currently, you can spend about $10,000 per year of your 529 plan on K through 12 education costs. And that, under this law, has been increased to $20,000 per year. And what it can be spent on has been expanded as well. So you can cover curriculum, textbooks, online materials. A real powerful feature is it's now can be used to cover tutoring, home tutoring provided by an unrelated tutor. So it can't be your mom who's tutoring you, but an unrelated tutor meeting all of the requirements. You can use 529 plan funds to cover that. Fees for standardized tests. If you are taking college courses while you're still in high school, you can cover that. And then also education therapy for students with disabilities. There was another post-secondary expansion, which I think is pretty interesting. If you've got leftover funds from your 529 plan, and you're going into your career and you need credentials. So for example, in our industry, that might be the CFA, the Certified Financial Analyst, or the CFP, the Certified Financial Planner, which I hold. You can use 529 plans to cover the qualified post-secondary credentialing expenses. So that would be tuition, fees, books, and other expenses for achieving or attaining that credential. Fees for maintaining that credential, or the exams to cover or obtain and maintain, and then continuing education to cover that credential. So just a pretty meaningful expansion to what the 529 plan funds can cover. Another kind of unique tax change that is going to be available going forward is qualified opportunity zones. This is a strategy that has been available historically and was really set to go away at the end of next year, in 2026. The Big Beautiful Bill has introduced kind of a more permanent version of the qualified opportunity zones that is really valuable for those of you that may have large pieces of property that when you ultimately sell, you realize a large gain that would be taxable. So how do qualified opportunity zones work? Well, at high level, qualified opportunity zones were introduced by the government for the purpose of promoting or incentivizing investment into areas that they believe need to be gentrified or could really benefit from improving the real estate or seeing investment in their area. So there are opportunity zones that are designated by states. And then when you invest in those, you get some benefits. So how does that work? Well, you sell your property and you realize a gain. Within 180 days of selling your property, you take the gain and you invest it into a qualified opportunity zone fund. At that point, the tax on the gain from your original sale is deferred, and it is deferred until the earlier of 5 years or the point at which you sell the fund. So if you sell the fund 3 years in, you pay the tax on the original gain at that point. If you end up holding it for longer than 5 years, you will pay tax on the original gain at the 5-year point. Now, if you do hold it for 5 years, depending on the fund that you invest in, you can actually get a reduction in your tax on that original gain of 10 to 30%. So that can be a real valuable thing. It doesn't just allow you to defer the tax, but if you hold it for at least 5 years, it will reduce your tax by 10 to 30%. And then the last kicker or benefit that comes from this is if you hold the Qualified Opportunity Zone Fund for at least 10 years, you don't pay any tax on the gain from the Qualified Opportunity Zone Fund. So it can be a real valuable tool, and it's one of the very few tools available to defer or reduce your capital gains tax due on sales of property. And now we've got something that's going to be permanent and won't be eliminated going forward. Okay, just a few more items here on the tax changes. AMT tax, alternative minimum tax, is something that certainly can be pretty complicated, and I won't get into all the details here, but essentially what the alternative minimum tax was designed to do was to ensure that high income earners were not reducing their tax so much by taking advantage of all the different deductions that they were paying very little. So essentially what the alternative minimum tax does is it minimizes the impact of deductions and ensures that high income earners are paying a certain amount of tax. And there's a certain amount that you can exempt from AMT tax. And under the Big Beautiful Bill, that exemption phases out sooner and it phases out faster. And so more people are likely to be subject to the alternative minimum tax going forward. Now, with all of the changes with this bill, interestingly, it has increased the risk of AMT exposure for those actually in lower income earning ranges. So for singles, that's $100,000 to $200,000, and for married filing jointly, if you're in the $300,000 to $500,000 range, and you're itemizing deductions, you do run the risk of being exposed to AMT under this new bill. Not guaranteed, but something that you want to consider with your tax professional as you prepare your taxes going forward. Last item that I'll discuss before I turn it over to Laura has to do with the new Trump accounts that have been introduced in this bill. Essentially, what this is an attempt for the government to fund retirement accounts for new children that are born between this year and 2028. They'll receive a one-time deposit of $1,000 from the federal government into these new Trump accounts. They are required, the funds are required to be invested in low-cost U.S. stock index funds, and you get tax-deferred growth on them. You can't take them out until you're at least 18. And then after the age of 18, they pretty much function very much like a traditional IRA. Parents and others can contribute up to $5,000 per year, and that will be inflation adjusted starting in 2027 going forward. But I think one of the most powerful things about these new accounts is that contributions by the U.S. government, states, and charities are not subject to that $5,000 limit. And so you can see charities or states make the decision to, or it gives them the opportunity to make donations to huge swaths of children and make contributions to these individual accounts for each of them. And now that has to be done in what they would kind of classify as a equal way. So it either has to be to every beneficiary out there, it has to be beneficiaries in one or more states or a qualified geographic area, probably like a zip code or something like that. Or it can be limited to beneficiaries born in a certain year. So if a charity wants to go out and say, hey, I want to give $10,000 to everybody in the Austin area or the San Antonio area, this gives them the ability to do that. Really cool additional feature that I think could be very powerful for nonprofits and charities that are interested in giving back to their community. So I know that was a lot of information. We will be sending out the slides. You guys can review all of this. But I think a lot of interesting changes that will be impactful going forward. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Laura, who will take it from here and move on to talking about spending cuts. Laura?
Awesome. Thanks, Max. All right. Well, I'm going to touch on some of the spending cuts and spending increases as provision in this bill, and then also touch on how the federal deficit is being affected and interesting things to note there. So we'll start with the spending cuts. The deficit reducing provisions as a part of this bill total to about $2.5 trillion. If we take a look at some of the larger line items here, Medicaid and SNAP benefit cuts at around $1.3 trillion, and then repealing and reforming of a lot of the electric vehicle credits that were passed as part of the Inflation Reduction Act at $540 billion. So those EV credits are expiring in September of this year, September 30th. So if you're planning on buying an electric vehicle, today is the day to do it. But I want to touch briefly on the Medicaid and the SNAP benefit cuts. It's estimated that about 12 to 17 million people in the United States are currently Medicaid recipients. And I think it's going to be really interesting to see how these federal cuts affect state budgets in areas where Medicaid recipients are highly concentrated. So I think about, my home state of North Carolina, we've got over 600,000 people currently on Medicaid in a state of about 11 million people. And with the federal uh, spending or not covering that, I think it's gonna be really interesting to see how states actually are able to cover that, if at all. So that's going to be an interesting thing over the next couple of years. Let's take a look at these spending increases. So the two most notable increases here are in immigration and defense. $176 billion increase for immigration. Now, this is over a 10-year period, and this is temporary as it's currently written into the bill. Obviously, if these increases are made permanent, it has an even larger effect on the total deficit, but for now, they are temporary. For our biggest line items here, $51 billion increase for border security and about $45 billion increase to expand immigration and customs enforcement and detention capacity. So pretty significant increases there. If we take a look at defense, $173 billion increase. Again, just like immigration, this is temporary over 10 years. But specifically, we got a lot more line items here: increase in air superiority and enhanced missile defense. And then our shipbuilding capacity are two of the largest spending increases for defense. The last area is $173 billion in other. And this is what a lot of people may refer to as pork spending or a slush fund, if you will. A lot of these provisions were put in place in order to encourage certain members of Congress to actually vote for the bill. But one area that I think is interesting is $47 billion for establishing a rural hospital fund and $13 billion to increase healthcare related spending. I think a lot of that spending increase is expected to help offset some of the blow, the cushion the blow from the Medicaid cuts. Rural hospitals are mostly expected to be affected by decreases in Medicaid. So I think it's to help those hospitals actually stay afloat and operate in the long term. But also a $12 billion increase to improve air traffic control systems. I think this is something that most of us can agree is beneficial for all of us, the modernization of air traffic control and continuing to keep us all safe there. So if we look at the total effect, as the bill is passed, the estimated deficit impact is about $4.1 trillion dollars. And if these increases are made permanent, that expectation is the deficit impact is about $5.5 trillion dollars. So as the bill is passed, there is a negative effect to our total deficit currently. And I want to take a look at what that looks like in overall. So we've talked in past Beyond the Noise webinars about our federal debt problem. Right now, we've got about $37 trillion in national debt, and our debt to GDP ratio is above 100% and is expected to continue marching upwards over the next 10 years. And if we look at our actual federal budget, right now we're running an estimated $2 trillion per year. And one of our largest line items on the spending side is the net interest on the debt. And I want to kind of hone in here for a second. This number is a little bit outdated. It's showing 882 billion. We actually spend over $1 trillion currently on our net interest on our debt. It's the second largest line item as far as spending is concerned, right behind Social Security. And the reason why I think this is really important, not only is it obviously a ballooning problem, but also we have a bit of a refinancing challenge coming due. We have a significant amount of debt that is expected to mature between now and 2034. And this year, $7 trillion of that debt is maturing. This is a can that has been kicked down the road for years, most notably a couple of years ago during the Biden administration. Janet Yellen solved this problem, and I put that in quotes, solved this problem by kicking it down the road 2 years. Well, here we are, 2 years from then, and the can is again at our feet. Um, and we're in an environment where yields are not particularly ideal or favorable to have to refinance this significant amount of debt. So, I think that it's really important that we continue to monitor and talk about the federal debt problem that we have. It's not something that is going away. It's been a very large, looming dark cloud that continues to move closer and closer and closer to us. And so I'm going to turn it over to Josh to discuss some of the ways that we can help to solve this particular problem.
Thanks, Laura. Before we move on to the next slide, I did want to point out one other thing, which is right now, President Trump is not happy with the interest rates that he's getting to finance the new debt at. And so he is continuing the trend that Janet Yellen started during the Biden administration of of trying to do short-term debt for the United States. And the challenge is every year that happens, it means larger and larger chunks come due each time. Right now, between now and 2034, we are looking at roughly 80% of all US debt coming up for a refinance. And so if specifically in the next 2 years, we ended up not moving that debt out 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, we could potentially hit a maturity wall that makes this year, which is a huge year, refinancing $7 trillion of debt in 1 year is a massive task. But we could be in a situation where in a 2027, 28, 29, we could be looking at a maturity wall that's in excess of 10 or even $15 trillion dollars. And that becomes really, really challenging to refinance. So I think that's something that's also important to note. So let's talk about when a country is faced with this kind of position, there's really four ways that they can deal with the debt problem. The first way they can deal with it is by growing their way out of the problem. Imagine the United States was just to make the math easy, a $30 trillion economy. And let's say that from a GDP standpoint, let's say that the overall tax rate was 20%. So they were taking $6 trillion of revenue each year. If the debt is getting bigger, one of the best ways you can do that is if you could grow your economy from 30 trillion to say 50 trillion, and you were still collecting 20% in taxes, suddenly your tax revenue goes from 6 trillion to 10 trillion. That is one way that you could ultimately, by growing, solve your problem because you effectively increase your tax revenue because your economy is larger. The second way you could do it is by actually paying off the debt. And any politician, or most politicians, roll their eyes at this possibility. Nobody has any intention of trying to actually pay off the debt. There's not been any realistic proposal that has ever been made to do this. The third option, and this is the option that most developed nations choose at the point that it gets too overwhelming, is they choose to inflate their way out of it. And they do that by ultimately inflating the value of the currency, reducing its overall total value, and effectively robbing the individuals who own bonds or cash of their purchasing power. And of course, the final way, and this is a way that's not been seen often, but it has been seen in some South and Central American countries, is just outright defaulting and choosing not to pay. So one of the things that's interesting about the Big Beautiful Bill is that it tips Trump's hat in terms of knowing which of these paths he is planning on going after. And the answer is growing your way out of it. That's his intention. And we like to call this the Hail Mary plan. That really comes down to three major factors. The first and most important by far is betting big on the AI revolution to drive productivity and economic growth. And to be fair, I don't think that this is a irrational thing to try to target. I mean, our belief is that the AI revolution will likely be one of the largest, actually will be the largest innovative cycle seen in world history. And so it is likely that we will see economic growth increase and therefore the overall size of the economy also increase. He also wants to, continue to promote growth by keeping tax rates low as well as keeping regulation light. But at the end of the day, once again, there are two crucial assumptions that somebody makes when they say we can grow our way out of it. And the first assumption is that that Congress won't be greedy and try to increase spending as rapidly as the tax revenue comes in. And that's something that Congress has struggled to do. We'll look at that here in a minute. The other really crucial assumption, I think, and I think this is really important, if you look at the installed electric capacity for the United States, we have roughly $1.3 trillion, I'm sorry, 1.3 trillion, 1.3 terawatts of power that we produce. And AI demands a dramatic amount of power to function. Really, three things: power, we need actual computing solutions, and obviously for both of these, we need a lot of money. Those are the three major components that you need to see an AI revolution really drive productivity. And you have to have all three, but one of them that we're really deficient in is on the energy side. If you compare us to, say, China has 3.4 terawatts currently of installed electric base. And right now, they're adding about 1 terawatt every 18 months. So over the next 10 years, they're expected to be able to get to roughly 10 terawatts of installed electrical base power. The United States right now is only adding about a 5% each year to that number, which means that we will be lucky if over the next 10 years we can get to 2 terawatts. Up to this point, we haven't really had a need to grow our electric usage, but now we have a very large one. And the problem is we don't have a lot of things in place to be able to actually increase that supply in a really meaningful way. The ways that probably will have to happen is nuclear, if it can ultimately be used, because that can generate a lot of very consistent power. Natural gas would be another one. Those are the two that have natural gas right now is the one that can come online the fastest. And the nuclear obviously can generate a lot of consistent power as well. So we'll have to see ultimately if that ends up happening. If we cannot generate enough power, it will be a limiting factor for us in terms of pushing forward the AI revolution, unless we can either come up with less energy draining ways to actually produce the computing power that's needed for AI, or we have the ability somehow to use other countries' electric production. But this is going to be a crucial problem that needs to be resolved. So back to 2019. If we looked back at 2019 before the pandemic, we were still spending more than we were making, but it was still within a semi-reasonable level. We were spending about $1 trillion more than we were bringing in. We were spending about 4.45 trillion compared to 3.5 trillion of income. Fast forward to today, then this is, I think, the really interesting point. Two things. One, we obviously have massively increased our spending. We're spending $7 trillion this year, which is bizarre. We shouldn't be seeing these kinds of increases, but Congress loves to increase the amount of spending that we're ultimately making. But notice this. If we could have somehow frozen the amount of spending to 2019 levels, we would right now be running about an $800 billion surplus. And that's one of the big things that there's a lot of advocates out there for right now is to actually try to get back to a 2019 spending kind of level and freeze it and put ourselves in a position where we could actually start to whack at the debt some with where things are at today. Now, the challenge with that, unfortunately, is we're in a political reality where the Republicans had a very, very narrow margin, very similar to Biden during his administration with the Inflation Reduction Act. Joe Manchin was the most powerful person in the country because he was the most moderate Democrat. And so whatever he wanted, he got because his vote was absolutely necessary to pass the Inflation Reduction Act. In a similar way, Trump and the rest of the Republican caucus ultimately were reliant on a small number of very moderate Republicans in order to get the one big beautiful bill passed. In the case of the Senate, it was a three-person There was a three people they could afford to lose, and in the case of the House, they could afford to lose one. And so as a result, we didn't see many spending cuts because, at the end of the day, if you go back to your district and say, guess what? I cut the amount of money you're going to get, not usually the most popular campaign promise. And so I personally am very doubtful that we will see any congressional members look to meaningfully try to cut spending. And at this point, now that the one big beautiful bill is passed, any spending cuts that would have to be enacted at this point would require 60 votes in the Senate or a two-thirds vote in the case of the House, both of which are, I mean, if you couldn't get it done with a threshold of 51%, you're not going to get it done with that much higher threshold. And so that leads us to the last thing that I wanted to say, which is right now, I really believe that our best chance of seeing meaningful spending cuts are going to happen at what I'm calling the brick wall moment. Right now, Social Security, more money is being taken out than is coming in the form of payroll taxes. About 79% of all of Social Security is paid by payroll taxes that come out of our paychecks today. The other 21% is currently covered by the Social Security Trust Fund, which is set to run out in 2034. I will note it used to be 2036 or 37, and in the last 4 or 5 years, they've had to revise that estimate down. So it could happen sooner. But when that happens, I'm hoping that Congress will get enough pressure from everybody else to ultimately enact some spending cuts to really start to rein things in. But outside of something like that, I think it's going to be very difficult to see that ultimately end up happening. So, with that very positive, encouraging note, we will open things up for questions.
Well, thanks, Josh. Appreciate you wrapping us up there. We have had a few questions come in, and we will run through those. As a reminder, if you would like to ask a question, please send those to my email address at max@thefoxalliance.com. So, Josh, the first one that we got, I will direct to you because you had mentioned some thoughts about interest rates. And the first question is, where do you see interest rates going through the remainder of Powell's term? So more specifically, with Powell ending his term here near the beginning of next year, what do we see playing out in that respect?
Yes, this is a complex question because there are interest rates that the Federal Reserve ultimately determines, which is the short-term rate, the rate that banks can borrow money overnight. I do expect to see that number come down. Even under Powell, I think there's a good chance that you could see a rate cut, or even two this year.
Yeah, I think the
But
markets are anticipating that will be one
that's
of
what the markets are
competitive.
anticipating.
Yeah.
Additionally, Trump is looking to start stacking the Federal Reserve with individuals that want to cut rates as well. So it's a math game. At the point that Powell leaves, there's a very good chance that he has enough individuals that will look to more meaningfully decrease interest rates. But here's the challenge, and this is what a lot of people don't realize. Just because the central bank, the Federal Reserve, lowers interest rates does not mean that you see short-term, medium-term rates like 10-year, 20-year US government debt have interest rates that go down. Because guess what? During the last part of the Biden administration, Powell ultimately did cut rates, the short rate, the rate that you lend overnight to banks. I'm trying to remember, was it a quarter percent or half a percent?
I think it was a quarter.
Yeah.
I think it was a quarter of a percent. Guess what happened to medium and long-term rates? They went up. Why? Because at the end of the day, the market or individuals who buy government bonds did not believe that it was worth lending money to the US government for a smaller rate. In fact, they thought that the risk had actually gone up. So I think that's an important point to mention is just because the Federal Reserve lowers rates, it does not mean that we will actually see interest rates that affect the broader economy actually go down. Because most of the mortgage rates that individuals like you and me pay from is based on the 10-year treasury. And that rate can follow the central bank, but as we saw back during Powell's last drop, it didn't necessarily. And so I think that's an important distinction to keep in the back of our minds.
Next question I will direct towards you, Laura. It has to do with the big beautiful bills passage with taxes and those sorts of things. And did that have any impact on our ability to do Roth conversions going forward?
Yeah, great question. So there were no provisions in the bill that affected our ability to do Roth conversions or not. There's nothing that said you can or cannot do that. We have been doing Roth conversions pretty aggressively over the last 6 years with the passing of the TCJA. As you mentioned, Max, it brought taxes down to a level that were the lowest that they'd been in over 100 years. And it made it a really great opportunity to pay the taxes today at a much lower level and have all of that tax-free growth in the future and not have to worry about where tax rates ultimately went. So with the current tax rates being extended, it actually makes it a much more favorable environment to continue doing Roth conversions. We still don't know where tax rates are going to be in the future. Obviously, as Josh mentioned, in order for rates to go up, that requires an act of Congress at this point. But for a lot of people who are doing Roth conversions, myself included, I've got a long time till I retire, and who knows what will happen with rates at that point. So I think if anything, it made it even more encouraging from a Roth conversion perspective to see if it makes sense and to continue that strategy for the foreseeable future.
I would add one other thing to that, Max, which is if you look specifically at the Social Security tax deduction piece that'll be in place for the next 4 years, for individuals that are under that level, it actually has made it even more advantageous for those individuals for the next 4 years.
Yeah, great point. Okay, next question, Josh, I'll direct towards you as it has to do with energy because we were talking about that earlier. With the AI power needs, is there a likelihood that we're going to see small modular reactors help with that? Is that going to come back into fashion?
So the answer is it absolutely can. The question is, will government regulators ultimately let it happen in a fast enough time frame where it can be impactful? So Trump has submitted an executive order to try to streamline the process to allow um, small nuclear reactors to ultimately be used, like the modular ones that are being referenced in this question. The question ultimately is one, will the administrative state be actually execute on that well enough? And then two, the moment Trump leaves office, does the next administration also continue to allow it to happen? Because the challenge is the nuclear administration and the nuclear agency has been very, very challenging to work with. Like we're talking a minimum of 10 years to build anything nuclear. And that's the problem. Like right now, as I mentioned, China is trying to take their energy production and increase it by roughly a terawatt every 18 months. A large chunk of that is from nuclear, and they're building a nuclear facility in roughly 2 to 3 years. Um, that is something that we have never been allowed to do. Now, hopefully, the executive order and some of these other things will push that forward. But we're definitely going to want to see the beta test on this. The modular reactors that are trying to be approved now and be built, can they actually execute in a reasonable time frame? And because the challenge is with AI, the power need is in a J curve right now. And even the best case scenario for nuclear is that, we're 2.5 to 3 years away from seeing power. So could it be helpful? Yes, but that's going to be predicated predominantly on will the regulatory regime be favorable enough to allow a at least relatively quick um, um, increase in the power. That's the challenge, honestly, is like even natural gas right now, to build a good natural gas facility, you need about 2 years. So almost everything that we would attempt to use that could massively increase electric generation in the US is something that we have to start immediately in order for it to really begin to have a meaningful effect in the next 5 years.
I'd also add on to that, Josh. I think that there also has to be a change in the perception of nuclear at a social level. I think that's going to be a pretty big, hopefully not challenge, but I think that's going to be kind of a hard hurdle to jump over. We saw, I don't know if you guys saw last week, there was a data center in Oklahoma that basically the people of this community came together and squashed the growth of this data center Amazon was building in Oklahoma. So I think we're also going to need a bit of a change on the social side as well.
You're right. I do think one thing that will be helpful is obviously these data centers don't have to be close to large population centers. So it does lower the hurdle, but you're right. You still ultimately have to have enough buy-in that people don't squash the projects.
Okay, last question. Are you guys aware of there being any future rescission bills that could help reduce future spending? Are any of those on the docket currently that you know of?
I think sure, there's been rumors, there's been talk about that, but once again, the challenge is anything that is not a reconciliation bill, like the one that was passed, would require 60 votes. And so you still run into the same challenges, which is you couldn't lose any Republicans, and you'd have to pull some Democrats over, which would be political suicide. And I mean, like we've seen a little bit of bipartisan work together, specifically surrounding some crypto regulation and a few other areas. But those are areas that have pretty broad-based bipartisan support. Spending cuts is not an area where there is a lot of broad bipartisan support. To be blunt, even within the Republican Party, there's a large chunk of representatives and senators that are opposed to anything dramatic.
Yeah, I mean, we had the one that was passed and it was $9 billion, which doesn't go very far when you're dealing with a $2 trillion deficit.
No, and a $7 trillion budget. So
Right.
it's like knocking a penny off of your dinner order. It just doesn't have that big of effect.
Yeah. Well, that's all the time we have for today, guys. I appreciate you joining us. We are grateful to have the opportunity to serve you as our clients, and we look forward to seeing you guys on the next Beyond the Noise. Have a great day.